I'm going to be starting the webinar now, inshallah. So everyone's going to be joining in, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
Recording in progress.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا مولانا وحبيبنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. O my Lord, expand my heart, ease my task for me, and untie the knot from my tongue, and allow them to understand my speech. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm Muhammad. I'm a first-generation Palestinian from the occupied city of Nablus. I'm a social media strategist as well as the founder of the Palestine Diaspora movement, the first ever diaspora Muslim-led initiative aimed at connecting the diaspora around the world and leveraging our collective power to bring about national liberation. A few months ago, students across North America took the solidarity movement by storm. Over 100 encampments erupted in just a few days that lifted the movement to new heights and set the example of commitment to our struggle. The demands of these encampments revealed the deep connections between the ruling class institutions and the Israeli settler colonial state, exposing the hypocrisies of higher education in the imperial core, and the brutal suppression that followed was only a testament to the pressure the student movement exerted over the ruling class. These universities enroll us, these communities, these global institutions, these governments, these political parties, they rally behind us for our radical activism, for our theories of liberation and equality. But when these ideas are put into practice, when they are taken out of the textbook, when they are put into action, they are no longer welcomed. Instead, they are met with suppression and brutal crackdowns. On April 25th, after being unlawfully arrested and violently beaten by OSU PD, I shared a moment of dua and prayer with my fellow protesters who were also illegally arrested alongside me. And during our peaceful demonstration, while our heads were in sujood and prostration, officers began their violent and brutal police raid, brutalizing us in salah. Now, the reason I mention this is because being on the ground, remembering how our faith is centered in in the struggle for Palestinian liberation, and following the lead of our people in the homeland will truly result in our liberation. Now, whether it's on campus, in encampments at OSU, or at protests across the globe, we are constantly reminded the complicity of these corrupt officials who do not represent us. These genocide supporters and enablers of mass murder claim to want peace, justice, and dignity for people, but they continue to confessedly defend and empower a fascist settler colonial state in which the ends justify the means. Assalamu alaikum to you all, and welcome to PDM's exclusive webinar, Resistance Until Return, How the Diaspora Can Serve the Homeland. Today, I invite you to listen, to relearn, to refocus, but most importantly, to recenter the voices of our people in the homeland. We welcome all Palestinian diaspora from across the globe. We welcome all of our allies as we take a moment to strategize in the midst of the most horrific episode in all of collective Palestinian memory. But of course, we cannot begin this program without first remembering the lives of our freedom fighters, of our martyrs, of our imprisoned. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy on our martyrs, to accept them, and to grant patience to their families. We ask Allah to strengthen our resistance. We ask Allah to use us in the path towards liberation. I ask you to join me in a quick 2-minute dua before we begin the program, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Mawlana wa Habibina Muhammad. اللهم لك الحمد أنت خلقتنا اللهم لك الحمد أنت بلغتنا اللهم لك الحمد أنت هديتنا اللهم لك الحمد أنت آمنتنا اللهم لك الحمد بالإسلام لك الحمد بالإيمان لك الحمد بالمال والأهل والمعافاة كبأت عدونا وأظهرت أمنا اللهم لك الحمد على ذلك حمدا كثيرا طيبا مطيبا مباركا فيه اللهم لك الحمد على ذلك حمدا كثيرا طيبا مطيبا مباركا فيه اللهم كن لإخواننا المستضعفين في مسجد الأقصى اللهم كن لإخواننا المستضعفين في غزة اللهم كن لإخواننا المستضعفين في فلسطين اللهم كن لهم مؤيدا وظهيرا وعونا ونصيرا اللهم انصرهم وفرج همهم ونفس كربهم وداوي جرحاهم وعاف مبتلاهم واشف مرضاهم وارحم موتاهم وتقبل شهداءهم يا رب وتقبل شهداءهم وتقبل شهداءهم يا رب العالمين اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا فاعف عنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين اللهم يا رب العالمين حرر المسجد الأقصى أعد المسجد الأقصى إلى رحاب المسلمين وارزقنا فيه صلاة قبل الممات Ya Allah, we ask that through your permission you allow us to be used in the path towards liberation. We ask that you grant strength to our martyrs, that you accept them, and you grant patience to their families, that you put blessings in our cause towards liberation and allow us to witness a free Palestine within our lifetime. Inshallah ya Rabb. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Mawlana wa Habibina Muhammad. Wa akhir da'wana wa alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. We have an exciting event planned for you today, an opportunity for you to truly step into your advocacy for Palestine, understanding how to turn your activism into action, to move beyond social media in the digital intifada, and to take it to grassroots mobilization on the ground. We have leading Palestinian activists and voices, leaders with us today. And inshallah, we're honored and thrilled to be alongside these powerful Palestinians who will help us better understand how we can serve the homeland. Inshallah, first on our agenda, we have the lovely Thuraya Zaidan, our co-host, the founder of Decolonize the Classroom. Thuraya is an experienced educator based in New Jersey with over a decade of teaching at both the high school and college levels. Her approach is firmly grounded in the principles of social justice and empathy. As Palestinian women and as an advocate, Thuraya specializes in educating on various issues related to Palestine. Additionally, she conducts presentations and workshops on multiculturalism and anti-racist teaching. Thuraya is also actively engaged in her community and dedicated to serving others through her work. Inshallah, today we are excited to have Thuraya join us as a co-host on this event and also educate us on the key principles of Palestine and how we can begin refocusing and recentering these principles in our advocacy. Assalamu alaikum, Thuraya, and we're excited to have you, inshallah.
Walaikum assalam. I am happy to be in community with all of you today, inshallah, and I'm going to be sharing my screen so that we can start our presentation. Okay, Bismillah. Before I begin, I would just like to take a moment to say that some of the information for a lot of us will be new. And as you're taking in the information, we want to be mindful not to be reactionary because that we know that that's the easier thing to do. And instead, we want to process what we're learning and engage in truly in an unlearning process as we want to center Palestine and Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, Nablus, Jenin, and across occupied Palestine. So as we're sitting here and in this unlearning process, which is necessary for so many in our community amongst the diaspora and those who are supporters of Palestinian liberation, if you feel that there's any discomfort coming up for you, know that that's okay. And we're going to work through this as we get to the side of centering Palestinians on the ground, inshallah. So first and foremost, we're going to be starting with al-Thawabet, which literally translates to principles in Arabic. And these are the core components of the Thawabet. And you can find these in the Palestine National Charter from 1968 that we'll preview on the next slide as well. And so as we're going through these, and we're going to go through all of these here, it's very important to note that it's not up to us to create an individual definition of liberation stemming from being conditioned in the West to center ourselves and what feels good to us and just our own perception. Instead, we want to come to terms with the fact that Palestinians documented these principles. And when we say that we're centering Palestinians on the ground, it's necessary and imperative, rather, that we're focusing on their principles. And so it's not up to us in the West. It's not up to even other Arabs or Muslims in different parts of the global community to come up with these, because our people have already created them. And so we honor them by abiding by their principles and supporting the principles that they have created for themselves as their own demands. So first, it's liberation from the river to the sea. And this is in accordance to 1948 and not to 1967, which we sometimes hear. Self-determination and self-autonomy. This does include from the Arab and Muslim world. So there are probably predominantly 47 Muslim nations. This does not include their take. So this is self-autonomy for the Palestinian people, self-determination, Al-Quds as the capital of Palestine, the right of return for at least 7 million Palestinians in the diaspora, and the right to resistance and revolution.
Thuraya,
Yes.
can you make sure that the slides are moving? You might have to put it into slideshow mode. It's stuck on slide 1, بإذن
No, I'm still on the first slide. Wait,
Oh,
it
okay.
is.
Okay.
No, I'm on the second one.
Is it on slideshow mode?
What about now? I just went to resume share. Are you able to see the Thawabet slide?
No, it's on centering Palestine, slide 1.
Okay, let's see.
If you'd like, I can share it as well, بإذن الله.
I'm going to just try one more time. Otherwise, I'll have you share.
Bismillah.
Can I have you share?
Yes, of course.
It's getting stuck for me. I apologize. I wish you told me sooner.
No worries, Bismillah.
Okay.
Are you able to see my screen? Is it visible to you, Thuraya?
Yes, but it's a small scale. Is that what everybody else is seeing? It's not a screen size. If everyone else can see, then I'm okay.
Yeah, let's proceed and I'll try to figure out how to make it bigger.
Okay, can we go to the second slide, please? Back to number 2, please. Okay, so inshallah, I'm just going to give everybody a moment to look at these. These are the Thawabet that I was just going over in the last couple of minutes, stemming from the Palestine National Charter. Okay, perfect. Okay. We can go to the next slide. I think we're okay. Okay, perfect. So as we're centering Palestinians in Palestine, again, it's very important to recognize that Palestinians do come from a place of firmness, and it is not up to us, neither in the diaspora or in the West or elsewhere, to create these demands or our own definitions for liberation. And as many of us engage in activism and advocacy around Palestine, if we are not centering the Thawabet, then in actuality, what's happening is we're not centering the people's principles or the demands. And so that's why it's very important that we're always referring back to them. And we are starting to see more people center the Thawabet and use this language. However, we're not seeing where enough people are normalizing this. In fact, many people in spaces of academia will say that they have not heard of these, and therefore, how can it be legitimate if it was not part of their academic studies? And so we want to recognize that those with class privilege and those who are in academic spaces are not those who are representative of the people that are on the ground, especially those who are disconnected either through their physical distance or their class privilege. And so it's important that we're always referring to the people's principles and demands in the process. Otherwise, we may want to consider that we are not actually engaging in activism and advocacy around Palestine if we are removing the Thawabet from our process. And so who in fact is the center of the struggle for Palestinian liberation? And I love that Muhammad included this in the introduction, Jazakallah khair. Our martyrs and our prisoners are the center, along with our people that are on the ground who are sacrificing for liberation that they may or may not see in their lifetime through their process. And so when all we're doing in what we're calling advocacy around Palestine is recounting summary points around the martyr death toll, then we're not actually centering the people on the ground. And so it's imperative that we are centering their principles and demands, the martyrs and the prisoners. And we often see in many educational spaces that the martyrs and prisoners are left completely out of the conversation around Palestine and liberation towards Palestine. And this is very ironic because they are the ones who sacrifice the most and will oftentimes be included the least in conversation and discourse around liberation. And so, and in reference to our allies, we also oftentimes see that allies or people who claim to be allies, want to center themselves and talk about how they feel and their feelings around this in response to the liberation process. And so we should be able to and must, in fact, decenter ourselves and focus on the martyrs, the principles, the Thawabet, and also the people that are living on the ground in Gaza, Nablus, Jenin, and across occupied Palestine. As someone who works with students and with young people, and we might have some educators in this space and people who work in their communities, even outside of what traditional education looks like, we see more times than not, people create a false narrative around Palestine by claiming that there are complexities around this truth. And in fact, this is a cause that is absent of complexities. And just some of these systemic issues that are listed here: colonialism, imperialism, land theft, supremacy, racism, occupation. These are all inherently intentional acts of violence, including, of course, erasure and this heightened genocidal massacre on the Palestinian people. And so when we talk about what is complex or what is conflicting in this situation, we must be mindful not to use language that may unintentionally contribute to the erasure of the Palestinian people by contributing to this narrative of the West and to mainstream media that claims that there are any complexities around liberation towards Palestine or the occupation of the Palestinian lands and people. And so when we center the truth, this takes us away from engaging in these kinds of conversations that are not contributing to the cause or to the people, and that are in fact taking away from the truth and are causing a form of erasure, in addition to the erasure that most of the world's governments have been complicit to. So what are our own individual and collective responsibilities? And, just as continuing from the last slide there, if we're looking at the first point, that it is our obligation to shift the narrative around a liberated Palestine. We must also recognize that we are not providing a service to the Palestinian people. In fact, Palestine serves the people. It allows you to extend your empathy, and it allows you to serve those who are most vulnerable. And so we want to be mindful not to engage in language or behavior that then centers you as an individual or your collective group that you're working with when it comes to supporting any community that is forced into marginalization, particularly here focusing on the narrative around a liberated Palestine. And once we're going to talk about normalization in the next couple of slides, but also, not engaging in persuading any person or entity that the Palestinian people's lives are of value, and drawing comparisons so that we are able to, perhaps gain some sort of recognition or validation from those who are actually oppressive. And so some ways that we can contribute in any capacity, and these are all truly bare minimum obligations from that we can engage in as individual people and in our collective communities. This might look like protesting, organizing, forming study groups centering Palestinian writers and prisoners, centering those who are most vulnerable in our communities, platforming principled Palestinian voices. And this is important because it's not enough to just have the Palestinian identity, but we want to also be sure that the voices we're platforming are Palestinian and principled, meaning that we are in line with the people's principles and demands. I think we do just have to go back one slide though. Okay, can we go forward one? Perfect. Of course, there are many examples of normalization. I have a few here for us to read through and reflect on. And if we are engaging in any of these, we can recognize that we have in the past or are currently engaging, and then begin to reflect on, and not stay in a reflection stage, but reflect and then immediately take action to undo this normalization. So some examples are supporting a solution that is outside of the firmly held belief that Palestine will be liberated from the river to the sea. And this is something that we'll probably discuss later in our panel discussion, or that may come up in the Q&A. But even as we're seeing with the upcoming election, language from some politicians that platforms their Western voices around what should happen in the cause for Palestinian liberation. What does this look like? And anything that is outside of this, even the voices that you may find that are the most progressive in government, anything that supports a solution outside of liberation of Palestine is considered a form of normalization. So how do we shift away from that and center what it is that the people want? Because the people are not voiceless and in fact are silenced. And so as we say that we're centering those living on the ground, how are we doing so when we are supporting elected officials that are either backed by Zionist lobbies or those who perhaps are not accepting this funding, but are centering their voices in the process around what Palestine should or should not look like? Also engaging with police and military, or even believing that Zionists are capable of contributing towards justice or equality. This might look like engaging with them on panel discussions. This may look like arguing via social media because of perhaps, and from a place of anger that's valid, but perhaps from belief that you need this person to validate the people or the cause. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. And so instead, your energy and your contribution is much more productive when you are serving your community, organizing, and being with those and supporting those who are most vulnerable, as opposed to using the energy that you have to engage in conversation with those who do not believe in the humanity of Palestinians. And it's very important to note that our people's value does not stem from anyone's recognition or validation. So some other examples of normalization in the context of Palestine looks like collaborating with either persons or organizations where the members are Zionists or engage in normalization, are aware, and then refuse to engage in the learning process. Sharing propaganda from Zionists, again, engaging in debates and panels, attempting to change perspectives, and accepting funds from foundations that are against anti-Palestinian liberation. Some examples of anti-normalization, now that we looked at some examples of what normalization looks like, would be upholding the Thawabet. And something for you to reflect on would be, how do I uphold these principles in my day-to-day life? And also for us to note that these principles are universal. And how do we platform Palestinian voices, particularly those on the ground? So, doing this in an authentic way does not look like finding your favorite Palestinian influencer or model for that sake, and then platforming their page or their voice, and using that as a claim to center Palestinian voices. Our people are very well articulate, are very intelligent, and are very much capable of talking about their own experience from their lived experience and from being in line with our principles. And so it's important that from a social media perspective, for example, that you are following and centering the voices of and sharing the voices of those that are living on the ground. Where it's appropriate, you can also recognize your privilege and leverage that privilege. So how are you able to do that in spaces with principled Palestinians in the diaspora that you are in community with? Another example can look like protecting Palestinians by not releasing pictures and names. And we see this with all communities that are forced into marginalization in the context of the United States, protecting those from marginalized communities. Here I say Palestinians because this is our focus today. But this also looks like our Black and Brown brothers and sisters who are in solidarity. And an example of this can be thinking back to the encampments in the last months. And so are we protecting those that we want to support in this process towards liberation? And also, recognizing that the struggle for Palestinian liberation and the suffering of Palestinians is not a spectacle. And it's not for us to decide when to turn on and off based on just our personal capacity. And, this is going to be something that we focus on for a few minutes a day, like in between reality TV or other happenings in our day-to-day lives. This is not an authentic way to center the Palestinian people in this process. And so also as we're, resharing and having exposure now for at least 10.5 months, and for those of us who have been in supporting, the community for many years now, being mindful of what it is that we're sharing. We've seen instances, for example, of people in hospitals in Gaza who talk about wanting some privacy in their final moments before martyrdom. And so when we come across these very personal human experiences, is that the first thing that we feel compelled to share, as opposed to perhaps written testimonies, which we're seeing many of? And so what have our martyrs said about normalization? And I'll give you an opportunity to read through these. I'm going to read the one in the center there by Basir al-Araj. Even do not even for a moment forget the existence of the occupation or normalize its presence in your life. And if that happens, you are creeping towards treason. And so when we think about our behaviors and our actions day to day, and as we want to not engage in a defeatist mindset and lens, and use our sadness and our anger and our feelings and emotions that are valid, how do we channel them in a way to serve those in our community who are most vulnerable as we support the struggle for Palestinian liberation? How do we support Palestinian communities? How do we support those on the ground? And so this is why it's very important to not dismiss behaviors of normalization as perhaps, not being in community with one another, or, as reactionaries may say that this is a divisive sort of behavior. Because as we know, it's far more challenging to recognize our wrongdoing and to sit with it and to reflect, and then, most importantly, to take action to reflect the unlearning process. Can we actually go back for a couple of seconds? And as we think about Palestinian martyrs, back, not forward, I'm sorry. And as we think about Palestinian martyrs, it's very important to also think about, when we are talking about Palestine in various spaces, who is it, whose voices is it that you're centering? And who are you listening to when you are either engaging in panels yourself to speak or going as an attendee? And we've been seeing a trend in the last months across college, university campuses in the country, where those who are being platformed are people who, yes, have spent some years doing research, but research in their leisure, and research within their class privilege. And we cannot highlight and platform this over those who are principled and have lived experiences on the ground. Because this entire cause in itself, it is the equivalent of the, you know, educational process for our people on this. And so for someone to do some research and some reading, and then to platform those who have made the literal highest sacrifice that there is to make on this earth, and to be more platformed, takes away so much from centering Palestinian voices and those who are living on the ground. And so we can learn very much from those who have sacrificed, from our martyrs, from our prisoners. And so, you know, who are we looking to when we want to expand our knowledge and when we want to reinforce what it is that we know around Palestinian liberation? And also, when we look at those who are on the ground, let's examine who it is that they're centering. Are they centering influencers, for instance? Or are they centering those in academia when they're talking about their experiences? These are just some examples here of the importance of language in the context of Palestine. One of them that I'll point out is using the word Gazans, which instead of using the word Palestinians, which we see very often in mainstream media, this does not refer to people who are living in Gaza and what they call themselves. We are not policing their language, and that's not the focus. We're talking about here in your, as someone who is not living in Palestine, we're seeing oftentimes in mainstream media this erasure towards Palestinian identity, and to say anything but the word Palestine, and to not call this what it is. And so this even takes us back very early on to one of our first slides around centering the truth and recognizing that this is a cause that is absent of complexities. And so what are some ways that we can show our support towards Palestinian liberation? And we can be Palestinian in the diaspora and be aligned with this. We can be non-Palestinian and support the Palestinian movement. So this would look like upholding the Thawabet. And I think we're sharing a link in the chat there that will take you to where these principles and demands originated. Supporting the liberation of Palestine when it's not trending. And we're seeing that, you know, this is something that people are talking about less in the months in some spaces. And of course, we're also seeing that almost 11 months in, there are still people who are going strong and who are organizing and mobilizing. And so as a personal reflection, where do you fit in? Is this something that we're sharing as we saw in the height of the Black Lives Matter movement when it was most trending, or is this something that is an actual focus in what we're calling our advocacy and activism work and is ongoing? Also considering solidarity and unity amongst all communities that are forced into marginalization. And this is something that we're going to go into later in our panel as well. And also using, you know, your own time and privilege and your labor to educate people in your circles instead of always waiting on Palestinians in your circles and in your communities to constantly carry the labor of educating those and helping those in the community with the learning and the unlearning process. So once we're at a point where we have reached this awareness, are we educating those in our circles? This might look like your family and your friend circles, but how are you expanding this so that we're teaching people and working with people who are then going out to do the same thing with others, as opposed to having this heavy reliance on only a few individuals, and expecting a level of labor that is even unreasonable, as we are also in the space where we are seeing this slaughter and genocidal massacre of our people, and the inability to process that while also engaging in these spaces. And so how are you leveraging your privilege, and what are you doing with the information that you've learned from fellow Palestinians? And are you carrying that labor to, as one of the many ways to support this movement? And these are just some more of the ways that we discussed over the last slides. And we can work in one of these spaces or multiple of these spaces, but I do just want to point out that if you were engaging in a couple of these 11 months ago, and right now you are still only engaging in the same spaces now, then it's time to make a shift and to add to whatever it is, in whatever way it is that you're serving. And so we should not be in the same place now that we were almost a year ago. So if a year ago I was engaging only in boycotting, this should not still be the only action that I'm taking now and labeling as my support. So I did just want to go over some of the symbols of Palestine. I may not go over all of them for the sake of time, because I did just want to discuss the correlation between principles related to Islam and to the liberation movement. But these are some symbols of Palestine. We have many, and we want to, shift away from only using the watermelon symbol. I doubt that many of you have seen Palestinians in Gaza and across occupied Palestine carry watermelons around. If they in fact can use the actual flag, then we will not contribute in erasure of the flag. So if they are on the ground and they are carrying the flag, then we should also be able to, in our places of privilege, represent in the way that the people represent. On the left there, we have a kafiyya, and on the right, we have the Dome of the Rock Masjid, which is an iconic historical symbol that the majority of the Muslim community views in the same way as well. However, we do see that the people who sacrifice to protect the Dome of the Rock Masjid are the Palestinians in Al-Quds. And although we'll see that Muslims across the diaspora and the global community will recognize this masjid as one of our most holy and sacred places, we do not unfortunately see a support towards preserving this place. And so also, what does that look like for those who are Muslim and are non-Palestinian? And do our words and our actions align? Here we also have Hamdallah, which many of you may be familiar with, and the keys that were left behind during the Nakba. And here we also have Tatriz, which many of us may be familiar with, even those outside of our Palestinian and Arab communities, and also the olive tree. And the purpose of sharing some symbols is really just to reveal that there are so many symbols outside of the watermelon, which has become really, and we recognize that perhaps this is unintentional, but starts to contribute to the erasure of Palestinian identity in a time where we want to preserve our Palestinian identity more than any other time. And I did just want to wrap up with some information regarding Palestinians and Islam. So over 96% of Palestinians in occupied Palestine are Muslim, and 99% of Palestinians in Gaza are Muslim. And it's very important to recognize that this is factual information related to Palestinian identity. And we're finding that there are many people who are triggered around this factual identity of Palestinians. And so we want to reflect and act on this truth. And so when we say that we are centering Palestinians, but we never mention the Islamic component that the majority of Palestinians identify with, then we must address this anti-Muslim sentiment that has been internalized. And so something that we're also seeing, and that we have seen, you know, over the last 10 or 11 months now, is that people will focus on Palestinian Christians as a way to allow those in their community spaces to develop empathy for Palestinian Muslims. And it's very important to know that Palestinian Muslims and Christians are in solidarity with one another. This does not take away from the solidarity when we look at the factual identity of Palestinians. And if you have ever had the opportunity to live in Palestine, in my opportunities of spending years living there, I have never seen anything outside of solidarity between our Christian brothers and sisters in Palestine. And so something that happens very commonly in the West is we, meaning the collective, many people in the collective, unintentionally or perhaps intentionally, are contributing towards erasure of Palestinian identity by wanting to remove the Islamic component, because being secular and imposing their own individual views is more accepting and appealing to Westerners than recognizing that Palestinians value their religion and are a people of faith. And also, and this is just the third bullet there, the struggle for liberation is an all-encompassing issue. This is not a compartmentalized issue. You know, when did we ever hear Palestinians on the ground say that Palestine is a feminist issue, or that Palestine is a queer issue, or that Palestine is an Afro-Arab issue? Palestinians living on the ground consider this all-encompassing. We don't use this fragmented language to compartmentalize. And, you know, yes, this is acceptably used language in the West, but we must recognize that this is not the language of the people. And so I have an example here from Ramadan, but we have seen this very commonly in the people's testimonies and in the interviews and in the videos that we are being exposed to on a daily basis, where the immediate response from the people is centering God. This is the immediate response. And so when we say we care about the people in Gaza and we want their liberation, we want to support them in this process of no longer being a people that are under siege or that are occupied, we cannot take away from them their lived experiences in reality and fact of this is part of their life. In fact, this is their life. And so we want to be mindful when we say that we center a people and we advocate for them. Are we actually centering them? Or instead, are you in fact only centering the version of them that you find acceptable? And then at the end of the slide there, I just have a couple of verses from the Quran that relate to martyrdom. And these are just some more ideas to reinforce what we went over earlier in the slide. Inshallah, I think we can move forward. Okay, so Muhammad, we can exit from the presentation actually. Yes. Thank you all for your time. I'm recognizing that for purposes of time and for the program that inshallah, we're going to resume into the next component. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to respond later in the Q&A or after the presentation.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا مولانا وحبيبنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. جزاك الله خير ثريا ويعطيك العافية. Thank you so much, Thuraya. That was so incredibly said. All the points were touched upon and so beautifully articulated. And I think it's just touching on Thuraya's insights, it's so essential to recognize that the Palestinian struggle isn't just political, right? It's deeply rooted in our Islamic faith, in Islam itself. Islam provides us with resilience, with strength. It provides us with the fuel of hope and commitment to our resistance. Whether it's the recitation of the Quran during airstrikes in Gaza or bombing campaigns, or whether it is the perseverance during Ramadan, as Palestinians are starved in Gaza under siege, our faith it's inseparable from our fight for liberation, right? And I think that if we are to call ourselves true advocates of Palestine, if we are truly to say that we want to represent the people of Palestine, then we will do a due diligence of representing their identity correctly as well. So, يعطيك العافية, Thuraya, and I think it's so important to have these discussions because the Western narrative often tries to dilute our faith to make our cause more palatable, but they misunderstand the essence of our resistance. And our struggle is very comprehensive. It's intertwined with our faith. It's intertwined with our principles, with our identity, with who we are as Muslims, but also if we're not Muslim, it's intertwined with who we are as people of justice, as stewards of people of conscience and stewards of justice and people who want to uphold basic human rights. So inshallah, I want to move on, inshallah, to our panel discussion. Feel free to ask questions into the Q&A, and we'll just kind of prepare for that towards the end segment of the webinar. But you can begin sending in your questions now, inshallah. Next up, we have an amazing guest speaker, and I will, inshallah, just share my screen very quickly. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Next up, we have our panelist and speaker, Nirdine Kiswani, who is a prominent Palestinian activist and the founder and chair of Within Our Lifetime, an organization based in New York City and dedicated to advocating for Palestinian liberation and building a grassroots movement for justice. Now, Nirdine has been at the forefront of organizing protests, educational events, campaigns, anything that you can name. She has been the center for Voices of Palestinians and a champion of mass mobilizations on the East Coast and challenging the injustices of Zionist colonialism. Nirdine is a highly seasoned Palestinian advocate and a leader within her community. And I'm so honored to have her alongside me. So we can all give, inshallah, a warm welcome to Nirdine as she will be joining us today. If you have any specific questions, just be prepared, inshallah, to put them into the chat, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, Nirdine. How are you doing?
Alaikum assalam. It's such an honor to be hosted by the Palestine Diaspora movement once again. Also, along with such incredible speakers, I learned a lot from the previous presentation by Thuraya. You did an amazing job. And alhamdulillah, I just think it's important that we continue to have educational events like this, that we continue to agitate, to organize, to mobilize in support of Palestinian liberation. While many people try to resume life as normal or turn a blind eye, it's more important for those of us who have been leading this fight to more than ever bring our community along and understand that what's happening in Gaza right now is our responsibility if we're not actively fighting against it, especially as people who live in the United States, who pay taxes to the nation, the country that makes this possible, along the heels of another $20 billion weapons agreement that the U.S. is going to provide to the Zionist entity over the course of the next several years.
يعطيك العافية, Nirdine, وأهلا وسهلا. Thank you for joining us and taking time out of your day. Nirdine, as someone who has been mobilizing for over a decade now and who has been in this space for a long time, particularly focusing on this last year, just these last 10 months, how would you describe the current situation on the ground in terms of mobilization efforts and direct actions?
I think, in the past year, we've seen larger mobilizations than we've ever seen before, particularly, right around like October, November. Unfortunately, that has started to dip in the last several months. And I think a lot of that is due to the state and political repression. Being taken off of social media is one thing, not having our largest platform as Within Our Lifetime, for example, to put our protests out there, even though, we still have community and other platforms that we're building up, but people who will also share it on Instagram, but also, people getting scared that if they, send their kids to a protest or if a family wants to come, that the NYPD is going to just attack them, arrest them, take their personal property, which is all things that has happened. And, I'll also say that at the NYU encampment, when they started arresting people, was also like as soon as the call to Adan was going on. So, using our steadfastness in our faith, to target us, to think that that is a moment of weakness instead of a moment of strength. But it's important for us to continue to mobilize. The protests are still going strong, maybe not as big as they were at the end of 2023, but bigger than they've ever been, and consistent in terms of the history of Palestine organizing in New York City to begin with. So, that's not a loss. And the people who are coming are, very hopeful. People of all different faiths, backgrounds, experiences, ages. They've actually started chanting "From the river to the sea, Palestine is almost free" instead of "will be free." So that just I feel like encapsulates a lot of the hope that people have, understanding that it's their responsibility and that our actions do have an impact. So, I think when it comes to any struggle, there's a lot of people who are going to jump on the bandwagon for the trend, but during these times, we're also seeing the sifting of people who were here because it's a trend versus people who are here because they believe in liberation and they believe it's their responsibility to bring it out.
Jazakallah khair. I appreciate that response. And I think that we have discussed, or we need to kind of discuss more about the need for activism beyond social media. I can't help but think about the importance of our faith in driving these efforts and how we see the role of Islam on the ground. But I also see the importance of communities working together, marginalized communities fighting together for that shared cause, right? For that shared goal of collective liberation. So Nirdine, in your extensive experience with on-the-ground mobilization, how do you see the unification of marginalized communities, especially Black and Palestinian groups, during direct actions? How do their struggles intersect? What lessons can be drawn from these collaborations to strengthen solidarity across different oppressed communities?
Yeah, I think a powerful moment from a recent action that we had against a Kamala fundraiser, which was the Kamala kickoff campaign in New York City and Harlem, a historically Black community, also where the encampments of both City College and Columbia, happened, which, was the encampment was built off of the idea that students who fought in 1969 for Black and brown students to be included, to be seen, to be accepted into these universities, which were basically white and continue to be in many respects white enclaves in Black neighborhoods. The encampments, built off of the idea that students, they occupied these campuses, demanding open access to students of color, demanding open access to Black and brown people in particular. And it's not that these universities did amazing or did right by them. Yes, they won in 1969, but these universities continued to be anti-Black in many respects, continued to contribute to gentrification. So even the encampments is just building off of that legacy of continuing to use the university as a site of struggle and understand their complicity in oppression, not just against the Palestinian people, but Black and brown people in the US and all over the world. And so, we were having this protest at the Kamala fundraiser, which was very nearby. And, there's been a lot of discourse online about people who are asking you not to vote for Kamala, don't support Black liberation, which is absolutely ridiculous, given that she was a prosecutor in California known as Cop Mala. People also protested her when there was an uprising against police brutality and police killing of Black people in this country, and the history of police in general as slave catchers, as well as Tim Waltz, who was known as Tear Gas Tim in Minnesota, where he called the National Guard on protesters. So it's just ridiculous that there's like, these kind of manufactured arguments that are likely coming from Zionists to try to paint us or the Palestinian movement as anti-Black for rejecting political candidates or politicians that have also been rejected by Black uprisings in their respective, spaces. And so, when you looked at the crowd, the most, one of the largest demographics there that were the most energetic, the most visible were actually Black people protesting against Kamala. And there was a very powerful sign that two Black women were holding that said, "Dream bigger than a Black woman committing genocide." And so, it's not enough to see our faces represented or people who sound or look like us or use our language or come from our backgrounds represented in the halls of Congress, represented as presidential candidates, when in fact their very presence is being used to justify genocide and oppression against our people everywhere. And so I announced at that action that if you were actually in the streets, you would see that our communities are uniting more than ever. Versus, what is trying to be played out on social media right now, which can be very curated. We know that they can shadow ban and suppress certain voices and, elevate others, and that this tactic has been used to further the American imperialist agenda. So, I think that it's focusing also beyond on just this particular moment, but the history of, people like Malcolm X, who was a prominent Black resistance figure, one of the most prominent Black revolutionaries in U.S. history. He was one of the first, Black people to go to Gaza, and he was, or Black Americans to go to Gaza. And he was also guided by, his faith in Islam and understanding that Zionism is irredeemable. We also have that history with people like Kwame Ture, also known as Stokely Carmichael, who also, talked about Zionism as irredeemable. And, these are things that have been connecting for generations, even before we were born. And it's up to us to keep that alive. And one way that, we do that, particularly indirect actions, and I'll give an example of something that we did recently, is like in January, we had an action in the Bronx with Black Palestine based groups like Bronx Palestine Solidarity Committee and others. And we actually stopped local connections like, the area where Khalif Browder, a Black man, was killed by the police. Also stopping by, housing projects where Black and brown people are subjected to horrible conditions by Zionist landlords who are actually using and taking that money that they're using, that they're getting by exploiting Black communities here and building settlements with it in Palestine. So, whether or not we want to make these connections exist. It's up to us to highlight them in real time. And when we were outside that building, so many tenants came out nodding their head, raising their fists in support of Palestine. And to this day, when you're marching through a Black community, you feel a different sense of solidarity, just a stronger sense of solidarity where people almost inherently understand what you're talking about versus, any other generic place in New York. So I know that covered a bunch of different angles, but if there's anything specific you want me to expand on, we can definitely do that in the Q&A.
Jazakallah khair, يعطيك العافية. I'm sure they were going to have many questions because that was so incredibly said, mashallah. It touched on a lot of points. And I'll just follow up and say, I think the hypocrisy from the ruling class institutions and from these politicians was very evident during the student encampments, right? Where the ruling class's connections to the Israeli settler colony were very much exposed, like you were mentioning. The brutal suppression of these movements by law enforcement is just as much of a testament to the pressure that the student movement exerts over the ruling class, the power that we have as the people. But it's really important, especially after the murder of Sonia Massey, a Black woman who was brutally killed by an American police officer in her own home, right? It's important to remember that, days after we were having massive protests for Black and Palestinian solidarity communities here in just in my local area as well. And we saw the unification of marginalized communities, especially between Black and Palestinian groups, especially during direct actions. It's so powerful because our struggles are so interconnected, and by standing together, we are strengthening our collective fight against oppression because we realize that it is the same systems that oppress, our brothers and sisters in Gaza that are also oppressing our Black and brown brothers here in America and our indigenous brothers and sisters here as well. So there is an understanding that by fighting for your liberation, we're also fighting for a shared cause here, right? My activism for you isn't transactional, right? I don't scratch your back because I hope you're going to show up to my protest, right? It's because we are, as people of conscience, as stewards of justice, we have to understand that these systems, right, they work to oppress all marginalized communities. And I love, Nirdine, that you touched on how our faith is so intertwined into this, the role that Islam plays in identity for Palestine. But more importantly, at these protests, we are seeing hijabi women. We're seeing visibly Muslim women. And in these last months, we've seen visibly Muslim women who have shared their experiences about not feeling supported, especially by Muslim men, and especially against police brutality and brutal crackdowns. And in these last 12 months, it's been definitely a topic of conversation. So, in your view, what do you think Muslim women need to feel genuinely supported? What does the collective need?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And I also just wanted to touch previously on what you mentioned before that, because yeah, I mean, I feel like we literally had the protest for Black and Palestinian liberation here in Brooklyn after Sonia Massey's the killing, the video of her killing came out, and the lies were exposed. And I felt like exactly we were more united than ever. And then you started seeing after that, you started seeing all these posts and attacks on social media trying to, divide our communities. And I think that's very intentional because they are afraid of our communities uniting. Black people historically, like the most oppressed in the US, with the most revolutionary potential. What they have gone through is illuminating for all of us here who live in the US as well. And understanding and following the Black radical tradition will often put you on the right side of history when it comes to Palestine as well. And they don't want our communities uniting. And I remember distinctly, like, police officers, captains of different police precincts here in New York City approaching Palestinian community members and telling them years ago, and I'm talking about like the elders, because they thought that they could like control us or try to get to us. And they would tell them, oh, look, we support Palestine. Like, your little cause is fine. You guys don't cause trouble. Just don't support Black Lives Matter. Just don't platform Black people at your protests. And this is something that we've always rejected. And the fact that they don't want us to unify is just a testament to how powerful, our struggles are together, because ultimately they both strike at the heart of US imperialism, which is responsible for oppression within the US and around the world more than anything else. And I think Muslims need to understand that our enemy is not just the Zionist state that's bombing our people. These bombs would not be possible without US tax dollars, without US weapons manufacturers, without US military aid shipment. And so this idea that, oh, like, we're going to save America's soul. America just has to stop listening to Israel and everything will be okay. And you just have to stop AIPAC, as if the interests of AIPAC, whether or not AIPAC exists, the interests of AIPAC are one and the same of, US imperialism's interests. And so, it's important for us to, directly mobilize and not just think that we're going to be accomplishing anything through through like voting, through politicians, through lobbying, instead of actually, coming out to these protests and putting your body on the line. At the Kamala protest, a hijabi woman actually had her, a Muslim hijabi woman had her hijab ripped off. There's videos, and we are also wary of posting things like this because of how degrading and humiliating it can be. And this is how they want to present our people. And so we're not falling into that. But, we haven't posted this, but there are videos where you see police officers literally beat like small, tiny hijabi Muslim women. And this was just at our last protest, with batons, like, repeatedly. And, it's just shocking that at a time where we're hearing about the highest level of police brutality used against Muslim women here, or visibly Muslim women while protesting, we're also hearing horrific reports of rape, of sexual assault and abuse happening in Israeli prisons against Palestinian women and children and men. We heard a couple months ago the story about Palestinian women in Hebron and Al Khalil forced to strip naked in front of Israeli soldiers and walk in front of their families. And this is not new. I think it's hard or it may have been hard for people to talk about it because Israel wants to humiliate us in that way. But, I've met with and talked to Palestinian former prisoners who, like Rasmiya Oda, who years ago exposed how they tried to get, her father to rape her. Force her father to rape her, use, and these are very graphic terms, but, how can we avoid this subject when people are going out on the line and making this known so that maybe the Muslim Ummah can wake up, but like literally have electric materials fused to their genitals and get electrocuted through them, getting sodomized and raped through like various objects until their bodies fall apart. And these stories are not new, but they're coming out in greater and greater volume lately after the lie that Israel said, that Palestinian resistance did this to them, although they've never even accused us of anything like that in our history until after October 7th. But, prior to October 7th, there has been countless reports, countless amounts of evidence of Israelis, Zionists doing this to Palestinians, and that hasn't been focused on. So the fact that, that's happening and we don't have a major crisis in the Muslim Ummah here, waking up and taking to the streets and, sounding the alarm on this, which is what our protest at Kamala was about too. We told people bring rape whistles, bring safety keychains, and these are things that I think could be implemented everywhere. A safety keychain is like, if a guy's following you, if you feel like you're at of any threat, you just pull the keychain and it won't stop sounding a very loud alarm unless you find it and put it back in. So it could ring off indefinitely. So these are protest tactics to kind of sound the alarm on the mass rapes that are not being addressed by our Muslim community. It makes me feel like if this happened to our sisters here, they wouldn't care and they wouldn't do anything either because it's happening in Palestine. And the response has been pathetic. And honestly, I think it's a very poor reflection on our ummah here, our community here in the United States. And, I think in order to truly call ourselves Muslims and embody that, we do have to behave as if we're one ummah, as if those are our sisters who that's happening to, and take action accordingly. And unfortunately, I don't know much else to say besides that's just not happening right now at all.
Subhanallah, you make a very crucial point when we discuss how the Arab world and the Muslim leaders have turned their back essentially on Palestinians and their suffering. It's become very I guess you could say theatrical, their support. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, behind the curtains, they're sitting at negotiation tables with the Zionist enemy, discussing normalization and, economic deals and political deals to strengthen ties and relations between their countries for their own interests and for their own personal gain. We have always known of the treachery of Arab and Muslim leaders, but never have we seen such an escalation in it, right? This has been probably the most, I would say, in our collective memory as Palestinians, evident example of treacherous Arab leaders turning their back on the Palestinian people. I think a quote from our resistance that always comes to mind when I think about this is when our resistance fighters say that you can stand in solidarity with our corpses, but if you do not stand in solidarity with our rockets, then you are a hypocrite and you are not from among us. And that is exactly what we see today, right? Like, we'll support the Palestinian people, but don't be so violent, right? Like, don't resist or resist this way. Having the audacity to critique the resistance of the Palestinian people without truly even supporting their right to revolution. So, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Nadine. You touched on such incredible points, and so honored to have you here with us and to be able to share this space with you and learn from you. And I'm so excited to be able to use this as an opportunity to continue to grow not only as an individual, but inshallah as an organization as well. So Jazakallah khair. I ask everyone to follow Within Our Lifetime on Telegram as well as on Twitter. And inshallah, bi'idhnillah, Allah will allow us to witness a free Palestine within our lifetime, inshallah.
Ameen, inshallah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Jazakallah khair. Inshallah, next we have our panel discussion with Hind Hamdan. Hind is a former board member of several prominent Palestinian organizations nationwide and is a highly experienced mentor within the movement. She is very well seasoned and very educated about the Palestinian struggle for liberation herself. And inshallah, this segment of the panel discussion will be hosted by Thuraya. And so I will inshallah get them both on the screen here. In the meantime, you guys can continue to ask questions bi'idhnillah and be prepared for the Q&A session afterwards. So inshallah, Hind and Thuraya, as you guys prepare, I'm just going to spotlight you guys here.
Sure, great. Thank you so much. And that was very informative and very powerful to hear from Nardeen's perspective regarding the solidarity and unity amongst the Black community and the Palestinian community, as well as the lack of call of action from our Muslim Ummah and what it is that we need to move forward. Hind, I'm just going to, inshallah, be asking some questions so that we can get your insight. As a person who has taught and mentored youth for years, considering the nature of U.S. higher education, how do we nurture one another in a way that uplifts and encourages the collective?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for having me. Nardeen يعطيكي ألف عافية والله يحميكي. I know for a lot of our organizers and this new generation, this younger generation that is taking the lead, that there's been a lot of risks involved, and your steadfastness, your sacrifice, your visibility is deeply appreciated, especially given the amount of surveillance that is occurring and policing and monitoring of our communities, and in extension, marginalized communities in general. I think this question is a very deep question because we have to understand the essence of higher education and the role that it plays in movement building, but also the role that it plays in movement containment. And I think when we look back and learn from the Black liberation movement, we see that there was a movement occurring that was parallel, but ultimately uplifted the movement that was going on in the street. And the university setting was intended to uplift and center the street, not overtake it. And so it's interesting when you study the history of higher education to really look at what are these institutions representing, what do they protect, and who do they ultimately serve? These institutions from the get-go are violent institutions. They have displaced and stolen land from the indigenous people. They have collected even their bodies as so-called artifacts and housed them in their storage bins for so-called research, abducting them in the same spirit that the Zionist entity abducts the bodies of our children and even harvests their organs. We have cemeteries, unmarked graves, at prominent universities of slaves, people whose bodies were stolen from their homelands. And the intention of US higher education from the onset was to acculturate and assimilate and consolidate people into servants of US empire. And so if we are organizing in higher education as students, we have to be very mindful of what these institutions represent and what they can become in terms of agitating imperialism and agitating the veins of imperialism within our own communities. It's unfortunate that a lot of these universities prey upon marginalized communities in the form of DEI and representation and prestige, that if you get in, this is going to do good for your community. And oftentimes we see students really buy into that without much of a warning from the elders like myself now, who are saying you got to be careful because within these institutions are things like interest convergence, which is a CRT, a critical race theory principle, that by accepting people, there's a gain. You know, you can give people crumbs like an admissions acceptance, but in having them present at the university itself, you're benefiting from their so-called diversity through the visual of what that means. You're extracting from their research and their labor. You're monitoring them. You're studying their behavior. You get to see what they're doing in their student organizations and contain them essentially. So that's why I go back to the point of paralleling and upholding and centering the street. If we are disconnected from the working class, if we are disconnected from our communities, if we return as students to our communities as a representative or a voice on their behalf, then we are reinforcing the elitism that these predominantly white institutions are meant to uphold. So we have to be very careful of the nature of US higher education, especially when these institutions protect things like their donors, research, company partnerships. So there's a lot at stake here in what the university is willing to allow, and there's a limit to what they will allow, which speaks to the violence that we saw around many encampments. So when we look at this and we see that there was policing, there was censorship, there's always been censorship and policing at these universities. This is not new. They do get violent. We see assassinations of Black Panther leaders on the steps of US universities. When this violence has been historical and regular, then we have to be careful that we are not uplifting the ivory tower of academia, but instead utilizing that space to agitate in order to bring forth the working class people into all spaces so that they do have a voice. So in order to uplift, simply stay connected to the authenticity of the community that's being advocated for. There's a lot of co-optation that occurs. A lot of symbolism that occurs in place of actual action. And I think it's interesting because Paulo Freire talks about this at length with student movements in general, is that even educators are afraid of what the next phase will be. And I want to challenge the students watching. We're in a new phase right now. This has not been seen within the US at all. To see people at least understand what Palestine is. When I come from a generation that they called us just Arabs and terrorists, we didn't even hear the word Palestine. So as we accept this new phase, it's also important that we don't get stuck and fearful of what the next phase can be. And in order for that next phase to happen, we have to be inclusive, not in the spirit of corporate marketing, diversity and inclusion, but we have to look around and see who is not standing with us in these universities. Who is it that we need to carry their voice? And for Palestinians, that's our front line. That's our resistance. That's our martyrs. That's our prisoners. In addition to the many working class that exist in our community here who don't have access to these institutions. So how are we making sure that classism is not seeping through and dividing us as well? So, I would challenge and maybe push back on and give a question to the students, to faculty, to educators, and think, how are we collaborating in organic and genuine ways with the aspects of our community that don't have access to that ivory tower?
Thank you for sharing that. You make some really excellent points. And I think that it's very powerful for our students and educators to reflect on their involvement in the community and to be connected in that way in order to serve and to not fall into the trap of becoming assimilationists for this false illusion of acceptance in this capitalist society. So oftentimes we observe that those who sacrifice the most are also those who are most vulnerable in our communities. How can the community support those who, while they themselves are needing support, are extending themselves to the community?
I think understanding always in spaces of organizing, there has to be a level of trust. And that trust isn't necessarily, can we all be on a signal group together? It's the trust that you can be vulnerable and know that your comrades in struggle are going to protect your vulnerability, or you have the humbleness and the humility to say, my vulnerability is a risk to this space, and I must find a strategic way to contribute. And with the nature of the US in general, this is a capitalist society. We see neoliberal values of individualism being pushed through. It becomes very difficult for people to reach that sense of humility when they want to continue to be competitive and retain these definitions of what success means according to a Western society rather than what it means within our own community. So success within the Palestinian community back home might have very different implications than what we are used to here. So if we're going to talk about how do we support the most vulnerable in our communities, we have to understand too what vulnerability means and the degrees of vulnerability. Those who are working class, who are marginalized, are going to be the most authentic and push forward rather than those who have a career interest or a class interest to maintain. Those who have a class interest or are pursuing careerism or are normalizers, because if they normalize with Zionists, liberal Zionists, white saviors, and these types, they have something that they need to preserve. More than likely property interests back in Palestine or a position or title here in the US. Those individuals or those campaigns that preserve those individuals really harm our most vulnerable. And so it's important that we confront those things. And in extension, I think across all our marginalized communities here in the US, we have to confront the neoliberalism that has institutionalized our movements, put them into universities and nonprofits and NGOs, and take that back and put it back into the people's hands. I think that's extremely important because that's where authenticity is driven from, rather than through the filters of these Western institutions. Despite the vulnerabilities that might hold people back, there's also manufactured fear that I think these careerists and normalizers continue to manufacture so that they can maintain control, usurp visibility on social media, and dominate the language that is being used rather than center the language of the working class. The front line in Palestine are working class, and even those who do come from a business class or might come from some kind of wealth, their form of success is collective. And so their success is not built on the backs of those who are marginalized, because as prior speakers, all of you have mentioned, we view ourselves in a collective sense. We are a communal movement. We're not an individualistic movement. We have to beware in our approach towards those we view as vulnerable, not to minimize them, not to continuously victimize them, not to see them in deficit, but instead to see strategically, what value do they bring? What can we do to support them? And how do we safeguard them? Within our movement here in the US, it's been said, although I don't know if there's any statistics to confirm that, nor would I trust an institutional statistic at this point, because these are all funded by whatever institutions that have some kind of agenda. But I would say, just from my experience, a lot of women are involved in leading the movement and are putting their bodies on the line. You have Muslims on the line, you have Christians on the line. Christians who are being threatened in Gaza, their historical church is being bombed, and a severe attack on the indigenous Christian population of Palestine is occurring under, as we watch. And so understanding these demographics is also very important, that we're not treating our population as some monolith, but really bringing forth a diversity that is able to exist authentically without the fragmentation that was mentioned of DEI and so-called intersectionality, which I'm sorry to say, y'all, Kimberly Crenshaw did not tweet Gaza once. She did not mention it at all on Twitter, but is busy defending the cop, Kamala Harris. So when people come and tell me intersectionality and DEI, and they want to objectify certain vulnerable populations, it's because they want to contain them or keep them within the framework of legal structures here in the US, which is all Kimberly Crenshaw really addresses. Where is your internationalism? How are you connecting to other communities? And how are we finding that commonality in the sense of the systems and the historical context that are policing and oppressing us, rather than just the visibility that these brand name campaigns are using to performatively act like they're addressing what the system is doing to us.
Right, and just having that representation in itself suffice, and Nadine touched on this also, the identity in itself is not enough. And I think that's an excellent point you make about Kimberly Crenshaw and just us collectively having that awareness. I would love to ask you one more question before we move into our Q&A. So with institutional campaigns for diversity becoming more mainstream, how do you feel these have served our movement here in the belly of the beast, and what linkages does this have to our front line?
If we are in the belly of the beast, centering those who come from a privileged class simply based on their Palestinian identity, then we're not doing enough. That we have to acknowledge that being here in the US, unfortunately, we have absorbed some of the sicknesses of the West, that individualism, that capitalism, that careerism. And so if that's all we're able to see is tokenizing identities and then posturing them as the spokespeople of all Palestinians, then we're not getting to the authentic source of what our movement is about. We have to go to the source and make sure that we are upholding our resistance, that we're upholding our prisoners, that we're upholding our mothers, and really understanding what it is they are saying. I appreciate Palestine Resist at Telegram, the Resistance News Network, for really delivering the language of our people in English for the first time that I've seen in a long time here in the US, because that was being filtered through these classist narratives that really wanted to shy away from the nature of our people. They wanted to promote Palestine, but only did so through a framework that still did not threaten the heart of imperialism. And so I'm thankful that, again, this generation is coming up and doing these things to make sure that we stay aligned to the voice of our people, but also to their culture. And I think you brought this up too, the secularism that we see, the Orientalism that we see in tokenizing our people and treating them as symbols, in reducing our language to watermelons and spoons, as if we don't have people fighting on the ground right now. There's a reason for that. I think there's also some disrespect when here, within the spirit of these institutional campaigns that talk about DEI and diversity, they feel as if they need to speak on our behalf, as if our people are not articulate. Mm-hmm. We have scholars, and also, even if they're not scholars and did not go a traditional route of education, we have many in Gaza who are articulate. Our children are the most articulate in the world. Why do they need to go through the filter of a white liberal Zionist here in the US, or through an institution, or through the book of an Israeli academic who continues to live on stolen land? Why do they need to go through the filter of a so-called Mizrahi or a Mustarab who is manipulating their identity to drive some kind of forged commonality, when they come from other places and came in the spirit of colonizing our land and make up a majority of the settlers within the Zionist entity? So I'm not interested personally in this identity game, and especially this recent PSYOP that has taken place to try to divide us from our Black comrades. Mm-hmm. I'm very thankful for the Revolutionary Black Network that immediately took the charge and addressed this for what it is. Right. And hosted a panel of Palestinians and talked about this in earnest. And I encourage you all to go and watch this and see what authentic conversation looks like, even if it's uncomfortable, to get to commonality, alignment, and commitment to one another, not just solidarity, commitment. Right. And commitment means understanding each other's principles. And so if we're going to move beyond these DEI tactics and tokenization and co-optation, and even the exploitation and marketing and sale and profit that's occurring, concert sales, a doll, t-shirts, this is all the illness of Westernization. Our people are dying. You can't make money off the martyr's blood. The martyr is going to stand as witness against all of this. And it's that humility that I come back to. We have to understand how we are helping, and if it's truly help, and assess what is it really doing materially on the ground. Not a single centimeter of land has been liberated in full autonomy of Palestinians or the Arab people. Let's be real with ourselves. The Thawabet themselves, if we're going to center them, these red lines, these principles, uphold self-autonomy. If you're operating through these institutions, that's not autonomy. That's servitude. That's yes, sir, I'll do as you say. Yes, sir, I'll be sure the students are in alignment at the encampment and not pushing it. Yes, sir, I agree to your terms of the so-called negotiation. Yes, sir, here's a name of students that did XYZ. We had that come up here in the US in our encampments. And maybe it hasn't been said popularly, but that's very tragic when classism is inflicted upon our people and the unity is dissolved for the sake of preserving the safety of some who have career interests or academic interests.
Mhm. Thank you, Noura. That's very powerful and necessary reminders that everyone in the space needs to think on and internalize and respond to properly. Mhm.
Jazakallah khair wa atik al-afiyah, Hind. Always appreciate getting these words of wisdom from our seasoned leaders in the cause, and I appreciate all of the education that you shared with us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow it to be of benefit for those who are watching and attending, and allow us to not only listen but practice on the words that we are sharing today, bi'idhnillah. I want to say Ya'tikum al-afiyah to all the speakers. I ask that you all join us here on the spotlight. I'm going to just put you guys here. So Hind and Nirdeen, I'll give you guys a minute, but inshallah, we'll start the Q&A. We have a few questions already lined up, inshallah, and I will give the first question to Thuraya as we prepare to spotlight the other guests, bi'idhnillah. Thuraya, I want to ask a question from the guest that was directed towards you, and just so the audience knows, I'm going to keep everyone's name, anonymous, just in case, inshallah. So, a member of the audience shared that as a non-Palestinian Arab ally, how do we shed light on the Zionism behind certain funds and donations without seeming like we are rejecting aid going to Palestine? I feel like aid is being weaponized to silence what we are really advocating for. Thank you.
Mhm, mhm. So the question is in regards to how to reject the aid that's coming from a Zionist organization.
How do we shed light on the Zionism behind certain funds and donations without seeming like we're rejecting aid going to Palestine?
I don't know that our concern should be in the seeming space. I think that this is a time where we need to highlight and platform the truth. And if I'm understanding the question correctly, why would we not expose, oh, this is about grants, perhaps, or is this about grants? Why would we not expose where this funding is coming from? And if it's coming from a place that is anti-Palestinian, do we want to accept those funds? And what is this? What are these funds in exchange for? If this is anti-Palestinian, so I feel that we would perhaps need some more information on this, but I would look into this further. Mm-hmm.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you for trying to answer that. And inshallah, if we have the opportunity at the end, we can revisit and seek some clarification. I do want to ask the next question, inshallah, that is going to be directed towards Nirdeen. And inshallah, Nirdeen, a member from the audience asks, as a leader and organizer for Long Island, New York, our county has just passed a mask ban in order to deter and oppress our movements. How can I encourage people to still come out and support our actions without being penalized? Long Island is predominantly Zionist, which is why it's so important to continue to show our solidarity against Zionism.
Yeah, I think it's really disgusting that the mask ban just went through. Meanwhile, like COVID surges continue to rise, and there's a lot of confusion around the mask ban, which is in Nassau County, not New York City. But I think that they wanted it to start it in a place where they feel like they have a lot of power and control, because just keep in mind, like, this mask ban is specifically about Palestine protesters, they say this when it comes to everything. And in their language, they even say that if you use it due to illnesses or religious purpose or like a holiday, then you're exempt from it. But, you know, no one has really tested that exemption. So I think, you know, people who do want to wear it for health and religious reasons, I would say just continue to wear it, assert that, right? I think, you know, most of all of these laws that we're up against are unjust to begin with. This is just an added layer on it, and we know we just need to challenge them. Get in touch with lawyers in your community that are willing to challenge these laws. I think this is just a lot about fear mongering. You know, and I also think like, you know, it's not the end of the world to, and I'm not trying to minimize like whatever reasons people wear masks for. I'm not trying to minimize doxing or you know, trying to minimize the importance of also masking for health safety, but it's also not the end of the world if, you know, you're too afraid to wear a mask, but like you don't want to put your face or name on the line when it comes to Palestine. I think we should, you know, just push back a little bit against this like idea where if you're supporting Palestine, you know, you need to mask up inherently for your safety. It really depends on, you know, what you're able to risk. And, you know, some people can risk more than others. So, you know, I think it's still important to come out, that protest movements are always going to be maligned in history. And people may see it negatively now, but they'll understand that you're on the right side of history. And this reminds me a point earlier that you brought up about like, you know, people not wanting to talk about resistance and things like that. And it's always funny that a lot of these organizations that purport to support Palestine will talk about resistance in the past as if it's a good thing. So they'll, you know, lionize and uplift like Layla Khaled and Ghassan Kanafani and other, you know, Palestinian, you know, resistance figures, but they won't talk about, you know, resistance today, right now. That's something that they'll shy away from and even condemn in real time. So understanding that the trajectory of our struggle has always been one that is condemned, that is maligned, that is painted in a negative light. And, you know, inshallah, everything will come to surface, everything will come out to truth, and you'll be proud in your later years that you know, you stood up during a time when it was difficult.
Jazakallah khair, Atiqul Afin al-Din. I think it's so important to realize that the Palestinian resistance is both an individual and a collective effort. You know, it's really rooted in community where Islam plays a vital role. And our commitment, our resilience is in the face of what can only be described as the most horrific episode in collective Palestinian memory is that's the face of the ongoing atrocities. It's what sustains our fight for liberation. It's leading our way, and it's our obligation as the diaspora to follow the lead of our people in the homeland. The next question touches a little bit more about our identity as Muslims and what our faith plays in this struggle for liberation. And I don't know who else would be better to answer this than a panel of 4 Muslim diaspora. So alhamdulillah, we are well equipped to answer this, but it's going to be open to the floor. So whichever one of you feels you want to jump in, bi'idhnillah, or follow up after the other, bi'idhnillah. The question, and I've received this personally after making like several pieces of content related to how we need to stop removing Islam from the conversation around Palestine. I refuse to I refuse to make my cause palatable. You know, I refuse to compromise. I refuse to strip, you know, my identity as a Palestinian Muslim, as a Muslim Palestinian. I refuse to strip it of the essential foundations of Islam. So the question is, referring to Thurayya's presentation, the approach, in my opinion, is not productive if you say the Arab Muslim world. By this, you exclude all other Arabs with different beliefs. It's as if you are not Muslim, then you are not Arab. I wish that you approach this in a different manner where all people fight for freedom and justice. If you make it about Islam, is it going in the wrong direction? I would appreciate your thoughts and response on this.
Yeah, I would love to share, and if anybody else wants to add, that would be great too. So I think that it's important to address that we talked about this being an all-encompassing issue. So no one is negated from participating in this solidarity and this commitment. And when we talk about Palestinians being Muslim, we're just talking, in fact, about the Muslim identity. And the majority of Palestinians in Palestine are Muslim. And if something triggering is coming up for someone, I would examine my internalized anti-Muslim sentiment or Islamophobia. Because this, in fact, is just, we're talking about the identity of the people. This does not take away from any solidarity or commitment amongst other communities. We heard some of our panel speakers talk about unity with the Black community in this country, for instance. And we also even highlighted unity amongst Palestinian Muslims and Christians on the ground. And so I think that it's important to not only focus on and respond to the thing that we disliked as an individual, but to remove ourselves and to decenter our egos and to focus on the truth and accepting people in their wholeness. So we can't only accept the parts of the Palestinian identity that we enjoy or that we might benefit from, because the Palestinian identity is not just akifiyya and dabka and makluba, right? Like we want to be accepted in our wholeness and not in this partial version that someone with perhaps with a Western lens is opposed to. And so I think that when we want to center and support a people, we want to look at them for who they are, and we accept them for who they are, even if that means that we disagree with some of the things. And I think that it's okay to not agree, but we must remove ourselves in this process.
Jazakallah khair. Any follow-ups?
Yeah, I just want to read a quote from Al-Hakim George Habash, who's a Christian, and says, "My Arab nationalism, my being Christian, my Islamic culture, and my progressive Marxism, I am a Marxist, leftist by culture. The Islamic heritage is an essential part of my thought structure. Islam is the most important component of Arab nationalism, and Arab nationalism is an essential part of my being." I think it's important when this question is brought up that we look at the historical context and the material facts on the ground and the historical context of our people. And to simply want to come in with this colonizer knife and slice the identities from each other is a form of violence. And so I push back on this question and ask, why isn't that many things can be true at once? We are a unified people with a very deep ancient history that we are not shy of. And in that, our practices and culture, language, and understanding that amplifies our diversity. I'm sorry it doesn't appeal to the Western mindset, but we do coexist. We've always coexist. We don't even use this word coexist. We are one people. Walhamdulillah. And we know from the prior intifadas, for example, in Beit Lahem, the Islamic fighters were protecting the church and were in the church defending it from the incursion of the Zionist military. My question is, the more controversial question is, I think sometimes we face these points of secularizing our identity because it serves the Zionist interest to secularize this situation. Jewish nationalism, Jewish supremacy is codified within the Zionist entity in their law. Why are we not talking about that and accommodating this truth so that people here can do subpar so-called solidarity and not talk about the contradictions within their own communities? Why are we not talking about the hijacking of Christianity by evangelicals to promote colonialism and imperialism on the backs of colonized Christians worldwide? Let's talk about that. And also embrace that we're able to be a pluralistic society and embrace one another, as if Muslims in Palestine don't uphold Mother Mary as our mother. We do. She's sacred to us, not just religiously, but as a Palestinian. So let's be careful, of how much of this Western thought we have allowed into our brains.
Jazakallah khair.
I'll also just quickly add, because this comes up for all of us, especially in the context of the US, which is a deeply Islamophobic country that has used Islamophobia. And by the way, some of the largest think tanks in this country that have proliferated the highest amount of Islamophobic propaganda that is then used in turn to justify imperialism, justify war, justify occupation of not only Palestine, but our brothers and sisters in Iraq and Afghanistan, and bombing Arab and Muslim nations regularly, are actually Zionist organizations. So the organizations that are behind Islamophobia, like Islamophobia in and of itself, benefits Zionism. They understand that it goes hand in hand. They want people to have this, notion of, the big bad Muslim terrorists. And that's why they wanted to turn October 7 into their 9/11. Like they thought that it was still going to have that same impact that it had 2 decades ago, where, the T word was the big bad word and everyone was going to fall in line. But, that didn't happen this time. And it's important for us to push against Islamophobia to do this, it's okay to say thank God, right, in the US culture. So why is it not okay to say Alhamdulillah at a protest, or to chant Alhamdulillah or La ilaha illallah? And, this is something that so-called organizers in the US have tried to push back against me on. Colombia is great now, but just a couple of years ago, I had Colombia Palestinian students calling me an Islamist for saying that I'm not going to tell people that they can't chant La ilaha illallah when they're literally chanting. They have pictures of their dead family members in Gaza and in the West Bank, and they want to be able to make a collective dua for them with the masses that we've organized at a protest. And to deny them of that right, I think is so vicious and comes from Islamophobia. And even this notion that you'll be like, oh, Palestinian Christians don't get talked about enough, that's not true. I think we actually disproportionately talk about Christians and have our Christian brothers and sisters back more than anyone else. And it's the Christians here that don't talk about them because of their Islamophobia. So in order to really care about Palestinian Muslims, Christians of all different backgrounds, you have to fight against that Islamophobia. And it's come to a point where we've normalized chanting in the streets in the thousands, La ilaha illallah and Allahu Akbar, which they try to present in the media less than 10 years ago. If you say that, a bomb's about to go off. So how do we resist that actively? Not just pleading with people to be like, oh no, accept us, this just means good things, but actually doing it in our power, actually chanting it in our power and normalizing it. And so many people who come to the protests, and I know around the world, have actually converted to Islam since October because of that power that we have together. So, we engage in da'wah as well, not through directly telling people to convert or anything like that, but by, making it a safe space to be a Muslim. I know that, even sometimes Palestinian Christians will pray with us as Muslims, and they will make sujood, on the ground with us. And this is a dynamic that is not really understood well in Western culture, but Western culture also doesn't understand the essence or the roots of Christianity either. And we see that, as someone mentioned, I think Hind mentioned about, evangelical Christians. So I think it's important for us to, highlight the character of Islam in our struggle. Because, like you said, people would love to say Palestine is this issue, that issue, whatever, but then they'll tell you it's not a religious issue. Well, we know it's not in the context of there isn't this idea that Muslims and Jews have been fighting for 2,000 years, but, we are Muslim now. Our Islam is being used against us to further colonize our land. And this is literally called the Judaization of, Palestinian land, Palestinian historical sites. And, it's important to push back against that with facts and reality. And like Thuraya said, the fact on the ground is most Palestinians are Muslim right now. So it really doesn't help anyone to try to hide that here. And then when people hear from our resistance or they see what's going on the ground in Palestine, it's not reflected. It reflects really poorly on people who are just sitting in the US lying about what our struggle looks like, because at the end of the day, they're also just going to look like hypocrites.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair, Nardeen. That was an incredible answer. I don't feel like I need to add much to that, but I will just say that I won't hesitate to start my speeches for Palestine with Bismillah, with sending salawat on our beloved Prophet ﷺ, because I'm Muslim Palestinian, right? Like this is a part of why I stand up against colonial oppression, because my religion teaches me to, and I think it's so important to realize that even if we look at examples from across the Ummah, right, across the Muslim world, if we look at Bosnia, our Muslim brothers and sisters who faced genocide for so long and survived genocide and beat that anti-Muslim rhetoric in the heart of Europe, right? When we look at our Bosnian brothers and sisters, we can't separate Islam from their struggle against that colonial oppression, right? We can't separate their struggle against imperialism and the Western addiction to hegemony. It's the truth that Islam has fueled so many of these anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, right, resistance efforts. I think also I really want to mention that, like Nerdine was saying, that as the Zionist enemy was trying to paint, October 7th as their 9/11, their first attempt, right, their instinctive response is kind of like when you hit someone's muscle and they have that muscle reflex. Their first instinct was terrorists, right? Like this is our 9/11, right? It wasn't going after like even Arab, right? It was their instinctive was to attack the Muslim identity of the Palestinian collective, right? That was their instinct because they knew that that would be effective as it had been in the past, right? To garner global support for their genocide against Palestinians, to basically manufacture consent for their systemic mass murder of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, because it works in the past, even though it failed this time, right? People weren't buying it because they know that it's just not true anymore. And I think it's disingenuous, it's harmful, it's dangerous to remove Islam from this conversation about Palestine. Because when I say that I'm Muslim and I fight for Palestine because I'm Muslim, it's not removing the other Palestinians that exist, right? But rather it's embracing the essence of what our freedom fighters, our martyrs, our imprisoned lead us with. When the fathers of Gaza are holding bags of their children, right? When we are seeing the limbs of our martyrs on the ground, on rubble, right? And their mothers tell us, La ilaha illallah, hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. How should we respond? Right? When they tell us, Alhamdulillah al kul shay, right? After they see the martyrdom of their family, right? After an entire residential building is bombed by US funded Zionist airplanes and warplanes. How can we possibly say that Islam doesn't have a foundational role to play in their commitment to staying on the land? سوف نبقى هنا. They refuse to move, right? Islam is essential to that, right? It is that beating heart, alhamdulillah. So Ya'tikum afia. There's one more question, inshallah, again, open to all, bi'idhnillah, and I really look forward to your guys' answers on this. Someone says, I wanted to ask how electoral and identity politics are playing into all of this right now. It seems that many are trying to leverage their political careers, claiming to be pro-Palestine, but we know otherwise. From Kamala to now Green Party Jill Stein, what advice do you have to the voting issue?
I'll take a shot real quick, and I'll try to keep it brief. Participating in the systems of imperialism reinforces imperialism. In a system that continues to send massive funding to not just oppress Palestinians, but to create coups in different spots of the world, I think we have to be very careful in the sold narrative that voting is power. Like I mentioned before, I would really recommend, and there's still limitations maybe in conversation within the sphere of critical race theory, but really look at how interest convergence works, and that simply by allowing you to feel like you're participating, that's enough. And people feel like they have fulfilled some kind of duty. But in the end, how those things you're voting on are implemented, how they are articulated, and what they come to mean is not in your hands necessarily, but in the hands of the system. So be very wary of being used in the sense of just being included, and just be wary of being used in this moment. Anybody who's using our martyrs for an electoral campaign is not honoring our martyrs. That blood is holy. And I think, and I wanted to add to the point of secularizing our movement. When people make these comments, we deeply hold as Palestinians, Christian or Muslim, the martyr doesn't die. So when you're saying remove Islam from what we say, You want them to die. We don't say that they're dead. But to the system here, the transactionary system, the voting system, these are dead bodies. And they articulate them in numbers and manipulate them to win you over emotionally, to be a part of some election campaign. Jill Stein has repeatedly said problematic things about our community. She is upset that because of the genocide, Arab in Jordan and in Egypt are protesting, and she called them poisoned against the peace treaties that were established between the normalizing, co-opting, elitist, corrupt, killer Palestinian Authority and the Zionist entity and the imperialists. She has an interest in upholding these peace treaties. That's not to the interest of our people. Gaza has been under siege. The West Bank is under siege. Our people in 48 are under siege. And we have our refugees along the border who have the right to return, not in the framework of Jill Stein's assimilationist or come back and be equal with your killers and your rapists. That is not what we are fighting for. We want liberation, all land back, and essentially what the Thawabet demand. But this kind language, this savior, Karen, that Jill Stein represents, is not into our interest. So don't get used.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think like just to zoom out even past Jill Stein, because I think in a lot of Muslim communities, and I'm not talking about the elected officials themselves, but our everyday community members, you know, some of them, they won't even figure her as like a viable candidate. So, you know, they won't even talk about that, but then they'll try to redirect our energy into the Democratic Party. And I think that this is even more insidious because they'll say things like, oh, well, you know, we know they're not going to free Palestine. We know they're not the best. We know that, you know, this isn't going to liberate our people. But at the end of the day, we want someone in power who's going to be easier to fight against. And I think that that's just a fallacy that, you know, this idea that, you know, Kamala is going to be easier to fight against. And I'm not going to go into the merits of what Kamala is right, like literally to the right on when it comes to Trump. And oftentimes the Democratic Party is right, not like correct, but to the right of the Republican Party when it comes to foreign policy. But I digress on that point. I think this idea that America should get a facelift with this like first Black woman president and, you know, not reflect the reality of what, you know, the US project is really about is just another counterinsurgency attempt. You know, capitalism and imperialism will always realign or restructure itself to become more palatable. You know, there were masses chanting against genocide, Joe, and that's why he's out. So don't see this as like, okay, well, we got what we wanted and we need to move on. No, we need to keep pressuring, need to keep pushing against the Democratic Party. Rifat al-Harir, Palestinian poet, intellectual who was martyred in Gaza, one of his last tweets, either his last or second to last, he quote tweeted a video of Kamala Harris, and he said the Democratic Party is responsible for the Gaza genocide perpetrated by Israel and the USA. And these were like literally his final public words. And we have to hold the Democratic Party accountable, the entire political system accountable, even if that means they lose. Otherwise, we're normalizing genocide. This idea that we need to pay attention to people's rights here right now while ignoring genocide is absolutely ridiculous. If a politician doesn't care about genocide, they don't care about racism, they don't care about women's rights, they don't care about any other issue that you delude yourself to believe that they care about if they're cool with the slaughter, the mass slaughter of 186,000 people. And you know, this idea that those numbers are inflated is also something that I think, you know, we need to address collectively. And that's why I want to say it, that it's not an inflated number. If you're still using 40,000 after hearing that there are tens of thousands of bodies under the rubble, the 40 is just the people that they can count. There are areas that they can't even get to count. There are people's bodies being torn up and eaten by wild dogs before they are counted. And there are people dying from disease and from starvation. And we know in these scenarios, whatever number that they've counted, you can envision that it's at least 4 times, you know, higher. So if they're cool with that and they're just talking about a lukewarm idea of a ceasefire 9 months later, 10 months later. And honestly, like, I think from the beginning, the demand of ceasefire was always too lukewarm. It was never enough, because we know that the genocide on Gaza doesn't end when the bombs stop dropping. It ends when there is justice. It ends when there is accountability, land back. It ends when there is the siege and blockade and occupation and colonization of all Palestinian land ends. And there is no political program in the US by any politician that even comes close to that. So agree with not participating in the system, but also push back against those in our community who want to redirect the rage and anger that we rightfully and justfully have against this genocide into their careers, which is voting them in, supporting their campaigns. And they're doing this on a local level too. They're canvassing at the masajid. I don't want to name orgs right now, but we will soon if we have to get to that. But beware of these people and how they're using our struggle to get people to donate to 501c3 Act Blue campaigns that just reify the system as it currently stands, rather than speaking out against it or demanding the true accountability that we need from all those complicit within the belly of the beast.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair. Thuraya, would you like to add anything?
I agree. I was just going to mention the women's reproductive rights, and Nardine touched on that, because many folks are in support of Kamala because of her verbalizing support around women's rights. And again, you can't care about women's rights if you don't care about the mass slaughter of the Palestinian people. And then also just to tie your question earlier around what do we need from the Muslim Ummah? I mean, we need to not allow cops and politicians into the masajid. That could be a start, right? And so we do have, I think, more power than we like to admit and sit with at times. We are not just a defenseless people, and I think that it's important that we don't engage in this kind of normalizing.
Jazakallah khair, Thuraya. I would like to make a final point on this as well as we wrap up. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لا تقولوا عن من يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. Do not say about those who have been slain or killed in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they are dead, rather they are alive and you do not know. We have to realize that if you change the figurehead of an empire, doesn't matter. The next figurehead that will come will still uphold the same interests and ambitions of the imperial beast, right? It doesn't matter whatever figurehead comes to sit in the throne of in the belly of the beast, right? Whether it's Kamala, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Barack Obama, whether it's Joe Biden, they will continue to uphold this system, right? These institutions that have continued to kill and murder and unleash absolute horror upon our people and the entire global south, whether we've seen it in the Middle East, in Iraq, right? In Yemen, in Syria, in Palestine now, right? And all across the world, right? It doesn't matter who the figurehead is going to be. It's the systems at play. It's what they're going to be upholding, right? They're just going to be the face of these institutions that continue to uphold it. So I want to say يعطيكم العافية, جزيكم الخير. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to be in this space with all these incredible Palestinian women and educators and leaders. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow what we were able to discuss today to be of great benefit, right? And as I've said, I hope that it's not just that we're listening, but rather acting upon what we're talking about. I also want to emphasize that this is an ongoing process, right? Like your learning doesn't end here. The Cause for Palestine is not a one-time webinar. You must continue education, must continue learning, must continue refocusing to turn it into direct action. If you're committed to the movement, you're committed, for until liberation and after. So inshallah, I want to share my screen really quickly, and we'll do a quick outro, and we can wrap up bi'idhnillah. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yes.
Jazakumullah khair. Okay. So, inshallah, I just want to wrap up by spreading a little bit more awareness about our organization here, the Palestine Diaspora Movement, who, alhamdulillah, through the will of Allah, we were able to put this incredible webinar together with these incredible speakers. In short, we are the Palestinian diaspora. We are and their allies, and we are the children and the grandchildren of those who are exiled and forced out of their homes, right? Like my Sidi, Allah yarhamu, who was forced out of the village of Burqa in the occupied city of Nablus in 1948 and walked to a refugee camp in Syria before resettling in the Kuwait, right? We are those who have been passed down the torch of resilience, and now we are sitting, right, and watching this horrific episode of Palestinian history, asking how do we serve our people as the diaspora? How do we rise to the occasion? How do we fight to the right for the right of return, right? For the right of revolution. We make education on Palestine more accessible to you, right? We help mobilize thousands on the ground through the digital intifada. We've reached tens of millions of people through social media, and we've reached even more people through our resources on our websites that are all free to you. And we are committed to serving our homeland and centering our faith. Inshallah, I just want to share some of the resources that were made by PDM. These are all free for you to access, made by the incredible team at PDM, which I have to give just an incredible round of applause to them. And truly, they're such an amazing team. Everyone at PDM that works so tirelessly to make these resources and works day in and day out. We have crash courses on Palestinian history, on resistance, on how you can decolonize your vocabulary, join a global strike, on Ramadan and what it means to Palestine, and actions you can take for Gaza. And our newest resource, alhamdulillah, is the Resistance 101 crash course, which we've seen thousands of people complete already and been shared throughout our communities and have, inshallah, bi'idhnillah, bring great benefit to our communities about truly educating about what resistance is. Uh, I hope that you guys will be able to benefit from this, inshallah, and continue to allow us to support these webinars and these events and creating these uh, spaces where, you know, Palestinians have the ability to speak uncensored. And I ask that you help us serve the homeland and help us to continue with these different programs, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And as I wrap up today, I want to thank all of the incredible speakers and participants for contributing to this incredible conversation. I want to also thank the PDM team behind the scenes who has worked diligently to make sure everything runs smoothly, answer all your questions, make sure everyone can get in and out. And I want to ask that we move forward by keeping the spirit of resistance and solidarity alive, right? That we always remember that our fight for Palestine is a fight for justice that's rooted in our faith and our collective struggle. And until liberation, we will continue to resist, بإذن الله. And a final dua for our people in Gaza. اللهم كن لإخواننا المرابطين في مسجد الأقصى. اللهم كن لإخواننا المستضعفين في غزة وفلسطين. اللهم كن لهم مؤيدا وظهيرا وعونا ونصيرا. اللهم انصرهم وفرج همهم ونفس كربهم وداو جرحاهم وعاف مبتلاهم واشف مرضاهم وارحم موتاهم وتقبل شهداءهم يا رب، وتقبل شهداءهم، وتقبل شهداءهم. يا منتقم يا جبار، عليك بمن ظلمهم، عليك بعدوك وعدوهم. يا قوي يا عزيز، اهزمهم وزلزلهم وزعزعهم. اهزمهم وزلزلهم وزعزعهم يا قوي يا عزيز. اللهم أعد المسجد الأقصى إلى رحاب المسلمين. اللهم أعد المسجد الأقصى إلى رحاب المسلمين. اللهم حرر المسجد الأقصى. اللهم حرر المسجد الأقصى وارزقنا فيه صلاة قبل الممات. Oh Allah, we ask you through your kindness and your compassion and your mercy that you allow us to see a free Palestine within our lifetime, that you allow us to be used toward the path of liberation, that you allow us to do justice to the sacrifice of our martyrs, our imprisoned, and our freedom fighters. That you ask that you allow us to be a source of education, of knowledge, of wisdom, of blessings to this cause, and you allow us to truly uphold the principles of Islam and follow the example of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Jazakum Allah khair, ya'tikum al-afiyah. We ask you all scan this QR code and take this survey. I'll leave it up for a few minutes, but I ask you all give a round warm of applause, inshallah, for all of our speakers and guests. Ya'tikum al-afiyah. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you guys so much for an incredible event. Thank you to our speakers. Inshallah, you're able to catch that QR code. If you are not, this will be on our YouTube. You'll be able to watch the full stream. We ask that you all follow PDM on all socials for the snippets and the quotes. Jazakumullah khair to Hind, to Nirdeen, and a huge thank you to Thariya for helping me host this event and curate this program for all of you. And of course, a huge thank you to Shafika, to Ma'an, to Maryam, to Danya, and to the whole PDM team who are helping behind the scenes. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you and allow us to be able to continue this effort for the people of Palestine. So, ya'atikum al-afiyah. I'm Muhammad. It was an honor hosting you. Inshallah, we'll see you guys next time, bi'idhnillah. Assalamu alaikum.